Ahoy there! Captain Benzie here, coming at you with another episode of the Frigate Pilot's Manifesto, the series that aims to teach you everything you'll need to know to become a dedicated frigate pilot in EVE Echoes. In today's video, we're going to be doing another deep dive into one of the pirate faction frigates, this time around the Blood Raider Covenant's Cruor, which is probably the one I enjoy flying the most. It's got a very unusual playstyle, but is apparently one of the least popular of the faction frigates, which confuses me a little bit. That said, it has also just had a significant buff thanks to the October-November update, both directly to the ship itself, plus to a lot of the skills that it uses, and to the weapon systems and other modules that are fitted to the ship, so there is no better time than now to become a Cruor pilot, and so that's what this video is going to aim to achieve. We're going to have a look at the Cruor's stats and attributes and see how that all ties together in regards to how this ship works. We'll then look at how to fit it, the relevant skills that you'll need in order to pilot one of these things, and then we'll take it out into space and have a little bit of a look at a combat demonstration. If you do enjoy this video, then let me know by hitting like on it, sub to the channel for all things EVE Echoes, and make sure to ding that notification bell so that you never miss an upload. There are some giveaways on the way, so making sure that you are subscribed is the best way to make sure that you do not miss out on any of those. Let me know in the comment section below as well which frigates and topics you want me to cover in future videos. I love getting your thoughts and opinions, and I will always try and do a video on any topic that you guys do ask, because I know I'm happy to help in any way I can. If you want to help go the extra mile to support this channel, you can do so by joining us on Patreon. Details are on screen now. Finally, as with all of the Frigate Pilot Manifesto videos, these videos do expect that you've gone through the Catsgull Academy and that you have a fairly advanced understanding of the basic mechanics of EVE Echo. So if you haven't already, go to the Catsgull Academy playlist, make sure you're up to date on all the terms like what I mean by prop systems, how your capacitor works. That's a very important one for this video specifically. If you watch no other video on this, watch the how capacitor works before we jump in. Alright, that said and done then, let's jump in and talk about the Blood Raider Covenant Cruor. The Blood Raider Covenant are one of the 5 pirate factions currently available in EVE Echoes, alongside Sanchez Nation, the Guristas Pirates, Serpentis Corporation, and the Angel Cartel. Now, the Blood Raider Covenant are found mainly in Amarr Empire space, so if you are heading out through the Amarr Empire, especially toward the western side, you will start to see Blood Raider cosmic anomalies that you can go in and complete. And if you head into Nullsec out that direction, eventually you might come across a Blood Raider Covenant dead space anomaly. Clear one of those, and amongst the loot you should hopefully start to find things like Blood Raider Covenant debris, and you can then use that debris to reverse engineer the blueprints for the Cruor, the Ashamu, and the Balgorn. And of course it is the Cruor that we're talking about and focusing on in this video. Now, the Blood Raider Covenant themselves are sick and twisted puppies. They are religious zealots and extremists that were outcast from the main Amarr religion for being way too extreme. They have this big thing about blood, as the name might imply. They believe in draining their victims of blood, they drink blood, they commit blood sacrifices, they like to paint the walls with blood, and curiously, that actually goes across into their ship design as well, as we'll see in a moment. Essentially, the Blood Raider Covenant are the epitomal bad guys of the Amarr Empire. They are the boogeymen that are told in stories to scare young children into behaving. And that kind of has a knock-on effect, apparently, that a lot of folks in the Amarr Empire don't actually believe that the Blood Raider Covenant are a real thing. They're just stories told to scare children, they say, until one day a Blood Raider Covenant flotilla arrives and utterly obliterates their entire station, murdering everyone, draining them of blood, and yeah, it's not a fun thing to happen, a Blood Raider Covenant raid. You don't want to be caught up in that. Anyway, the actual Cruor itself, apologies for the flashing going on here, it's a bug on the phone I have, as ultimately I can only display at 60 frames per second, which causes flashing on some of the ship models. Here with the Cruor, I really like how this ship looks. It reminds me an awful lot of the Reaver ship in the first episode of Firefly, the one that follows them through space and breaks Atmo into the planet with them. Very cool looking ship, and I do love that little smile caused by the undercarriage as well. Anyway, talking about the actual trait description then of the Cruor, let's start to unpack what makes this ship work, how it actually operates, and what makes it different from the other faction frigates, because as I said, this ship has an incredibly unique playstyle, very different from other ships, and I love that. This is defined mainly due to this roll bonus here, a 100% reduction to the Energy Nosferatu overload penalty. Now, that is really confusingly worded, it makes no sense, it doesn't explain itself at all. I really wish they would reword this. If you've watched my video on how your ship's capacitor works, especially the section at the end on capacitor warfare and energy Nosferatus, you should know that a Nosferatu will only drain capacitor from your target as long as their capacitor has a higher percent than yours does. If your capacitor is at 51% and theirs is at 49%, the Nosferatu will no longer work until their capacitor has a larger percent. Doesn't matter how big their ship is, doesn't matter what the actual gigajoule value of that capacitor is, all that matters is the exact percentage, and if their percentage is higher, you can activate a Nosferatu. This roll bonus means that that is not the case. Even if your capacitor has a higher percentage than your opponent's, the Nosferatu will continue to transfer energy from theirs into yours. That is a very key part of what makes the Cruor and the Ashmu the Ashmu. It's a Blood Raider roll bonus, and basically it is all the Blood Raider ships therefore are all about draining their opponent dry and stranding them in space, leaving them utterly helpless, then ripping them apart, and it is a terrifyingly effective tactic, as we'll showcase later. Now, all of the faction frigates get bonuses from Advanced Frigate Command, usually tied into the weapon that the ship specialises in, and then they usually get a bonus from said weapon, like Advanced Small Cannon Operation for the Dramiel, or Advanced Small Laser Operation for the Succubus, that kind of thing. Here on the Cruor, that's actually Advanced Electronic Warfare, which, if you've watched my video on propulsion jamming, you'll know I'm kind of hoping that eventually one day Electronic Warfare gets renamed to Capacitor Warfare, and that Stasis Webifiers, Warp Scramblers, and Warp Disruptors get moved out of Electronic Warfare into propulsion jamming, but that's another topic and another rant for another video. In this case here, the Cruor gets a bonus of 15% Energy Nosferatu Efficiency, 15% Energy Neutralizer Strength, and 20% increase to Stasis Webifier Optimal Range per level of Advanced Electronic Warfare. Obviously, if you have that trained up to 5, that's a full 75% additional efficiency for your Nosferatu, meaning it transfers 75% more gigajoules of capacitor out of theirs into yours per cycle. The 75% Energy Neutralizer Strength, again, that is the amount of gigajoules flattened by a neutralizer, and a 100% increase to the optimal range of a Stasis Webifier. It doubles the range of a Stasis Webifier. Now remember that we have bonuses here to Nosferatu, Neutralizer, and Webifier, 3 separate mid-slots. Put a pin in that, we will talk about that in a moment. The second one, of course, the second skill, is always Advanced Frigate Command. Probably the most important skill after Frigate Command is Advanced Frigate Command, and this is why. In regards to the Cruor here, that gives a 7.5% increase to small laser tracking speed, very useful for short-range turrets so that they can track onto their target and better apply their damage, and a 25% increase to small laser damage. This was actually changed recently in the October-November update. Prior to that, it was only a 20% increase to small laser damage, which of course at full Advanced Frigate Command 5 was a 100% increase to laser damage. It's now a 125% increase, which is a surprising amount of extra DPS. Now, the small laser tracking speed, as I said, 37.5 there if that's fully trained. Does obviously help with beam lasers, but with pulse lasers as well, because obviously we've got a ship that is clearly going to be using neutralizers and Nosferatus. I'm sure you can already see that getting up close and personal, TM, is how we're going to be running this, so having a higher tracking speed on those pulse lasers is going to help them actually apply their damage and track the target that little bit better. Now, remember again that we talked about the fact that the Cruor has roll bonuses to 3 different mid-slots. As we look at the attributes and fittings here, you'll see the fitting profile is the same as the other faction frigates, all at the 3s across the board. 3 high slots, 3 mid slots, 3 low slots, 3 power grid rigs, 3 mechanical rigs. The problem here is with those mid-slots. Yeah, sure, you can fit a Webifier, an Nosferatu, and a Neutralizer, and you jump into PvP and your opponents just run away because you've got nothing to lock them in position. Ultimately, the Cruor would benefit from having a 4th slot so you can run all of those, but quite frankly, I would argue that the Cruor is one of the most powerful faction frigates in the game already, especially in regards to PvP. Giving it a 4th mid-slot would just make it absolutely insane. So I kind of get why they're forcing you to choose which mid-slot modules you actually want to use. The power grid as well is a surprisingly solid 88 megawatts. Key point there with the Cruor that we will come to again in a moment's time. I want to talk about that because that allows us to actually put an oversized module on this ship and have a lot of fun with that. Defensively speaking as well, the Cruor is astonishingly tanky for a frigate of this size. 4,216 defence across the board, 1283 on armour, and 1162 makes for a decent amount of structure padding as well in case your armour tank starts to fail. The 890 on the shield isn't exactly much, but it's also not to be sniffed at. That does absorb a couple of hits and allows you to get your ship up and running and get your tank started before you actually start taking hits onto your armour. So very useful, surprisingly tanky ship there as well. And it's got some nice resistances across the board, as you can see. 19% resist naturally to explosive damage, 25 to kinetic, 35 to thermal, and 50 to electromagnetic there on the armour. Good resists there to the armour. The capacitor of the Cruor, as you would expect from a ship that specialises in capacitor warfare and uses lasers as a turret system, has a very high capacitor here, 905 gigajoules, and it's got an incredibly aggressive maximum capacitor recharge rate of 9.35 gigajoules per second. This is a powerful capacitor, which is exactly what you would expect of a ship like this. Now, this is where things start to come undone a little bit for the Cruor, and it starts to show a couple of its weaknesses. If you look at the signature radius, 26.5 is still fairly small. It's on the smaller end of the frigates, but it is on the larger end of the faction frigates. Certainly it is bigger than most of the ones I can think of off the top of my head, and makes for a surprisingly large faction frigate, which means it's not ultimately the best at speed tanking. Flight velocity as well of 378 is slower than almost all of the other faction frigates as well. It's not slow by any imagination, but it's slow in respect to certain other ships, and that does provide a weakness for the Cruor. It means that the Cruor can be outrun if you haven't fit it correctly, and if your opponent is in a better position than you are at the start of the fight, they can control the range a lot better than you can. It means you have to really learn to pick your fights and fit accordingly. That signature radius as well, as I said, it's not the biggest, but it's definitely not the smallest either. You do take a few incidental hits along the way, especially since we're probably going to be using a micro warp drive to account for the fact that the flight velocity on this thing is pretty low. That means obviously that signature radius is going to balloon quite dramatically, and it really does make quite a difference. Obviously the difference between a 20 and a 26 meter signature radius, when you times it by 500%, is absolutely massive. Now for the rest of the stats here, warp speed of 5.0 astronomical units per second is fairly fast for relocating, but we do have a very high inertia modifier, despite the fact that our mass is actually pretty good. This makes the Cruor surprisingly hefty and quite slow to turn, slow to accelerate, and slow to decelerate. It makes it quite a lumbering beast as far as the faction frigates go, and again, that is something we do need to take into consideration when operating one of these things. They're not the nimblest of ships. Now, before we dive into looking at how to actually fit the Cruor, I wanted to spend a few moments just talking about the relevant skills involved in flying one of these. Obviously, I'm going to be showcasing the skills that I have, so if you do see any discrepancies between my stats and the stats that you have, hopefully this will explain where those discrepancies come from. If I've got additional range or DPS, more defense, flight velocity, that kind of thing, you should be able to see what skill it was that caused that discrepancy. Secondly, this gives us a chance to talk about how these relevant skills actually influence the Cruor, and which ones you should be training, and kind of allows us to have that discussion on what order you should be training those skills in. Now, obviously, with any ship that you're looking to fly, the first skills you should be maxing out are the ones that are relevant to the ship's bonuses, the ones that are named in the ship's attributes and fittings, basically. Now, with the faction frigates, and of course the Cruor, the first of these is Advanced Frigate Command, and if you've been watching a lot of the Frigate Pilot Manifesto series, you'll understand that Frigate Command and Advanced Frigate Command is probably one of the most important skills you can train as a frigate pilot. Makes sense. Benefits every single ship you have, but a lot of frigates get direct benefits from these skills. Now, the skill itself gives an increase to your frigate's flight velocity, means you have a higher top speed, plus you get a reduction to the frigate inertia modifier. Inertia modifier, again, is the stat that dictates how quickly you accelerate, how quickly you decelerate, and how tight your turning circle can be. Obviously, you need a tighter turning circle to maintain a good a short orbit at high velocity. Now, a lower inertia modifier is better than a high one, and as we've just seen, the Cruor itself has a very high inertia modifier, so we really do need to do something about that and bring it down into the region of control. Frigate Command helps us do that. It just helps us speed tank in general, and of course it gives a direct benefit to the Cruor itself. For every level we have in Advanced Frigate Command, you're getting an additional 25% DPS from your small lasers, plus that additional tracking speed as well. So if you were to only train Advanced Frigate Command to 4, you're only getting 100% additional DPS rather than the full 125, so it is well worth maxing this one out. For navigation, Afterburner and Micro Warp Drive are both useful skills to look into. What these essentially do is they reduce the amount of capacitor required to fuel that particular propulsion system, Micro Warp Drive or Afterburner. They also increase the activation time and also give an additional boost bonus. So the amount that the Micro Warp Drive or Afterburner actually boosts your ship is increased too. Now, essentially what this does with the capacitor need and the activation time, the example I always like to give, and you guys must be sick of hearing me give it, but I will say it every time just in case there's someone watching this who hasn't watched the others. Imagine you're paying £500 every 4 weeks to your landlord as rent. Training into this skill means you only pay £450 rent, and you only pay every 5 weeks. You're reducing the cost and you're reducing the frequency with which you must pay. Overall, a massive increase to your capacitor stability on this ship. Now, of the two here, as you'll see, Micro Warp Drive is the one I would go for with the Cruor. Advanced Afterburner can be used for certain fits, but the Cruor is definitely much more a Micro Warp Drive ship. Then if we have a look into the defensive bonuses here, now I've got Armour Operation at 4.2, that is one I am sadly lacking in and really do need to bring up. Essentially what Armour Operation does is it increases the speed that your armour repairers activate, so it decreases the activation time, they repair faster, and reduces the amount of capacitor required as well. And I think it's 15%, there we are, yeah, 15% for both those, 15% faster repairing cycles, and 15% less capacitor required in order to do that. Very useful on a Cruor, as you are going to be armor tanking for the most part. Speed tanking isn't something you achieve overly well with the Cruor. So being able to repair your armour that little bit faster is always a nice thing to have, as is Frigate Defence. Now this skill, as a basic, gives you 50 additional shield, 50 additional armour, and 50 additional structure. More hit points. More hit points means you take longer to kill. Then going into Advanced Frigate Defence upgrade, we suddenly get a 25% increase to both of these. Rather than just a straight up 50, it's now 25%. So bigger shield, bigger armour, bigger structure, benefits this even more, and it exponentially makes it nice and big. Here you can see I've got that at 553. Again, I would like to get this one up to 555 eventually, but 553 makes for some very solid frigates at this point in time. Electronics are where the Cruor itself comes actually really into its own. Now you'll see here my first Expert 5 skill, Expert Frigate Engineering. I've taken Frigate Engineering to 5, Advanced Frigate Engineering to 5, and Expert Frigate Engineering to 5. Now what these skills do as basic is they increase your ship's capacitor capacity. Bigger capacitor means you can have your systems running for longer, and you can have bigger, more capacitor heavy systems running for longer. It increases the size of your ship's power grid, which is vital if you want to be able to fit some of the bigger modules on. Sometimes, like with the Cruor, we have the ability to fit oversized modules. Sometimes it's just a case of if you haven't got Frigate Engineering up, then your frigate cannot fit the higher level gears. The difference between something like a Mark V beam laser and a Centum C-type beam laser, for example, isn't just the DPS, it's also the power grid requirement. So you are going to have to train into engineering to be able to fit the bigger, more powerful variants of weapons and other modules. Finally is the amount of capacitor required to achieve warp is reduced with this skill. And that's kind of a nice thing to have, but it's not really a game breaker for the most part. If we look at Expert Frigate Engineering, the reason I got this as my very first Expert 5 is because it affects every frigate I have, every weapon type I have, and it even affects destroyers. Not only do we get that capacity, power grid, and warp capacitor requirement boosts as we've seen before, we now also get a reduction to the power grid requirements for small missiles and torpedoes, and small turrets. That's across the board. That means this affects my Dramiel, it affects my Thrasher with their small cannons, it affects my Condors and my Coraxes and Talwars, it affects everything, thanks to that power grid need being there. And that is a very key part again here, because we're increasing the size of the power grid and decreasing the amount of power grid required to use our weapons, which gives us more space to fit other things. Now the Cruor itself as well obviously gets bonuses from advanced electronic warfare. This as a skill I am hoping eventually one day gets renamed to capacitor warfare, and it's made entirely about the Nosferatus and neutralizers, with warp scramblers, warp disruptors and webifiers instead moved into the propulsion jamming skill. But essentially what electronic warfare does normally is, in regards to the Cruor that is, obviously it's reducing the amount of capacitor required for a stasis webifier and a warp disruptor, increases the range of a Nosferatu there at basic. Once we get into advanced, it's increasing the ranges of a neutralizer and reducing the capacitor requirement of a warp scrambler. But it's also giving us those bonuses to the Cruor directly. The additional Nosferatu and neutralizer strength, plus the stasis webifier range. Very, very useful skill. Absolutely, Frigate Command Advanced 5 and Advanced Electronic Warfare 5 should be the two skills that you get maxed out first of all in order to fly a Cruor. Of course, being a laser ship as well, small laser operation and small laser upgrade are going to be useful skills to train into. What these essentially do, the laser operation increases the damage of your small lasers by, in the case of basic 5, small laser damage 20%, and increases the tracking speed by 10%. So we're getting a higher amount of damage and the tracking speed. This is very useful for any ship that intends to use pulse lasers because it's extra damage and it's the extra tracking speed, which allows it to stick to its target a little bit better. Small laser upgrade, on the other hand, increases damage, but not quite as effectively as small laser operation does. It's only 15% compared to 20%, but it increases the laser accuracy fall-off and the optimal range. This is more beneficial to a beam laser pilot, simply because obviously they've got the longer range, and I'd rather get 15% additional accuracy fall off to something that's got 3 or 4 kilometers than something that's got 2 kilometers. I'd rather get an additional 10% optimal range to a weapon that has 12 kilometers than one that has 5. That kind of explains that there, but ultimately you do want to train both. Having additional accuracy fall off and optimal range is still very useful for pulse lasers, as it allows them to apply their damage that little bit better, and things like the tracking speed is still very useful to beam lasers as well, because they have an abysmal tracking speed as standard, so it is worth training. If you're going to be using a ship like the Cruor that uses pulse lasers, start training laser operation first, then train upgrade after. Upgrade is not as important as operation when you're using pulse lasers. Now ultimately the order I'd be looking at here with the Cruor, definitely we need to get first of all the Advanced Frigate Command, followed by Advanced Electronic Warfare. I would then look into Frigate Engineering, then move into the weapon technology side of things by training into the small laser operation and small laser upgrade, because the amount of damage you do is not overly important. Your survivability and your ability for your E-War modules is much more important to how the Cruor itself operates, as we'll see now. I want to give a humongous thank you and shout out to Tutu, or TTEW, however the heck I pronounce that. I am sorry that I'm butchering your name. I want to give a humongous shout out and thank you to you for helping supply me with a cheap new Cruor after I lost the previous one that I was using to film this video up in tribute. Now I do want to spend a brief moment addressing that, so if you don't want to hear it and just want to get straight into the fitting section, look at the timestamps in the description down below. You can jump ahead straight to the fitting. In regards to tribute, basically what happened there, it's been all over Reddit and was treated kind of like a gotcha moment. Essentially, I spent 3.5 to 4 hours drifting through Veil of the Silent, Geminate, and a couple of other systems, Tribute, all that kind of thing, up in the northeast, trying to find some solo PvP. And essentially all I found was an AFK Moa, which I showcased actually in the background footage at the start of my November 25th update video if you want to see how that fight went. Spoiler alert, didn't go particularly well for him. Now, at the end of this sort of 3.5 to 4 hours, I finally decided I was going to make some jumps back to a station, and I got caught by 3 Phantasms and a Daredevil. And as I said, Reddit has, that's telling, isn't it? Reddit has kind of treated this as a little bit of a gotcha moment, kind of like, look guys, we got him, he's not as skillful as he said he was. First of all, I've never claimed to be overly skillful at piloting. Secondly, I would challenge the best pilots in the world to survive a gate camp with 3 Phantasms and a Daredevil. And thirdly, who cares? I'm flying a Cruor. I'm using this as a way of testing things. Simply put, To me, the concept of, it's the golden rule really, isn't it? It's that golden rule of don't fly anything you can't afford to lose. Undocking is consent to PvP, all this kind of thing. The only bitterness I had at the situation was the fact that I'd spent 2.5 to 3 hours looking for content, hadn't found anything, and had lost the ship before I was able to actually achieve anything remotely useful with it. And yeah, to lose it in a fairly useless way. Had I lost it in a 1v1, that would have been awesome. That would have been some really cool data that I would have learned about the fit that I was using and seen how that actually operated. But to lose to 3 Phantasms and a Daredevil, all I learned from that is, yeah, the Cruor definitely can't do that. We kind of knew it couldn't. But again, I just want to address the elephant in the room there, that a lot of people seem to think that, oh, you lost a ship, that's a really bad thing. No, it's not. In EVE, as far as I'm concerned, the boring part is earning ISK. The fun is dumping all of that ISK into a ship and watching it explode spectacularly. The best part of EVE is destroying and losing all of your ISK. I get into these ships only knowing that I've got other ones that I can back it up with later. If I lose this Cruor, I can jump into another one, or I can jump into my Daredevil or whatever and have some fun with that instead. And ultimately, I'm just going to keep blowing stuff up and enjoying those explosions until eventually someone gets me. You saw it happen in the Worm video. I laugh when I lose my ship, as long as it's a scenario where I learn something, or I can clearly see where I messed up, or just that my opponent was a lot better than I was. Anyway, that said and done, moaning over. Remember, if you undock a ship and you're flying in low sec or null sec, that is consent to PvP. Never fly anything you can't afford to lose, and if you do lose something, smile about it, joke, laugh, build another ship, fit it, jump straight back out there and go again. As for the guys up in Tribute, well, I would love to have fought any of you in a 1v1. You guys want to act like I'm not skilled, I'm a YouTuber with no skills, that's fine. Come face me in a 1v1 and we'll actually find out. I'm not saying I'm better than you, but I would love the opportunity to actually test that. With that rant over, let's talk about actually fitting the Cruor. Now, ultimately, I like to fit a ship so that it rolls with its bonuses. Ultimately, in this case then, we are embracing the Inner Blood Raider, going for that full-on capacitor warfare build. That requires a certain amount of considerations to be made. Obviously, if we're going to be using the bonuses applied by the Cruor, that means an Energy Nosferatu and an Energy Neutralizer are both key things to have fitted. And what is the thing you can say about Nosferatus and Neutralizers? They're short range. Therefore, there's no point using beam lasers, because beam lasers are going to put us out of the range of our Nosferatu and Neutralizer. Our top slots then are Core PC type small pulse lasers. Pulse lasers are the key aspect here. You can see very high DPS, 141 from each of these, optimal range is 5.83, accuracy fall off is 2.98, so we ideally want to be sitting at about the 5 to 6 kilometer mark with our orbit. Good tracking speed there, 644, that means that the Cruor is able to keep those turrets glued firmly to its target whilst orbiting at a very close range for a very high angular velocity. Now, this of course then goes with our Energy Nosferatu. Here I've gone for a Vricolarcus small Energy Nosferatu, 1 because I love saying Vricolarcus, 2 because it's the best one you can get on the market currently. This is draining 68.25 gigajoules out of the opponent's capacitor every 4 seconds. Now, key point to think there is if you round that up to 70 gigajoules, times that 4 seconds by 3 to give you a 12-second time, and I'll explain this in a moment, we're currently draining about 210 gigajoules out of the enemy's capacitor every 4 seconds, and of course that's filling our capacitor too, and we're in optimal range there, similar optimal range to our pulse lasers, so if we're in the 5 to 6 kilometer margin, we're getting the full effect out of that. Now, why did I do that quick bit of mental maths? Because we're using a medium energy neutralizer. Medium energy neutralizer obviously is a neutralizer that you would normally fit to a cruiser or a battle cruiser, but it fits here just about into the Cruor. This has an activation time of 12 seconds, hence the calculation, and an activation cost of 191. Hopefully you should be able to see that the Nosferatu alone is enough to feed the neutralizer. That means if we've got both of those systems going, not only is the Nosferatu hitting 210 gigajoules out of their capacitor every 12 seconds, it's also plugging mine up by more than enough to keep the neutralizer itself going, and then the neutralizer is doing another 389, which if you round that up to 390, you're looking at 600 gigajoules worth of capacitor flattened out of your opponent's capacitor every 12 seconds, and that is a terrifying amount of capacitor to lose, as I'll showcase later. Now, because we're going to be so close, it seemed to me that a warp scrambler was a better option than a warp disruptor. Ultimately, because it's got that higher warp jammer strength, you've got 4 points of warp jammer strength in one module here, rather than a maximum of 2 in a disruptor, and the limitation of that optimal range being only 13 kilometers isn't a problem at all, because we're going to be in that range anyway, and the fact that it actually switches off the opponent's micro warp drives is going to be a nice bonus as well. It means if we're lucky enough to catch them, they're probably not running away anytime soon, and hopefully if they have fitted an afterburner, then either we can micro warp drive after them if they try to outrange us, we can just activate a micro warp drive and keep pace with them quite comfortably, or we can hit them with that Nosferatu and Neutralizer, drain their capacitor to a point that they lose all of their tank, they lose all of their propulsion systems, and if they're using lasers or railguns, then all of their weapon systems switch off too. Great fun. To support this then, the low slots. As I said, I've gone for a micro warp drive here, Gisty C-type small micro warp drive. The main reason for this is, as I mentioned, the Cruor is a fairly slow ship. It has no specific bonuses to afterburner, it has no specific bonuses to micro warp drive, and as far as its flight velocity goes, it is one of the slower faction frigates. This means if you jump into a combat anomaly, you need to be able to close that gap very quickly, or they can just flee, or if they're something like a Daredevil, they have ways of keeping you at range with things like Weber fires, and you may not be able to actually maintain that speed well enough to actually close the gap. A Cruor that starts in a bad position can really struggle to gain the correct ground, so we use a micro warp drive to give us the best flight velocity boost we can in order to close that distance and control the range as quickly as possible. Now, once we're up close, you can choose to keep the micro warp drive on if you want, but I tend to deactivate it as soon as I hit range. That saves on capacitor, and then we use the Neutralizer and the Nosferatu again to flatten their capacitor, and we just disable them. The aim of a Cruor is to disable your opponent's ship, then rip it apart. Now, in order to do this, we need to stay alive. That's where a Corpi C-type small armor repairer comes in. Because we're using a Nosferatu, we are able to keep activating this and using it to sort of repair any damage we take to our surprisingly tanky armor tank section. And we've got an all-round damage control here. As passive, this increases my shield, armor, and structure damage resistances by 8.64 across the board. That's to electromagnetic, thermal, kinetic, and explosive. We get all of those resistances there, and I can activate this for 13 seconds. That will give all of those bonuses there an additional 800%. Basically, while the all-round damage control is active, you have incredibly high resistances, you take very little damage. The aim here is that once we hit combat range with our target, we hit the Scrambler, we hit the Neutralizer, we hit the Nosferatu, and we activate the damage control the second that they get a return lock onto us. We are hoping to completely switch off their tank, their propulsion, and their weapon systems before the damage control runs out. Once the damage control has run out, we then have the armor repairer to try and keep us alive for as long as possible whilst we flatten their capacitor. Ultimately, the aim and your win condition is getting your opponent down to 0 capacitor. Now, in order to achieve this particular fit, here in the mechanical rigs, I've gone for auxiliary thrusters 2. That gives us that extra flight velocity, again, helps us to close the gap a little bit better. And remember, 15% additional flight velocity, which then applies the full 500% additional flight velocity to the micro warp drive. It's 500% extra to that 15%. That's a big, big boost to the micro warp drive speed. We then have a polycarbon engine housing. This again reduces our inertia modifier, so we can, once we activate that micro warp drive, we hit our maximum velocity a lot faster. We're able to maintain a tighter orbit quicker, and just actually maintain that 5-kilometer orbit quite comfortably. This one you can swap out for a dynamic fuel valve if you absolutely feel the need to get a bit more capacitor stable. The second one then here, sorry, the third slot here, then is a semiconductor memory cell 2. This is arguably the least important of the 3 mechanical rigs. Capacitor-capacity multiplier 20%, that is currently giving me a capacitor stability of 9 minutes and 48 seconds with everything running. If the enemy ship isn't dead in 9 minutes 48, I don't know what to say. It's obviously not a good target for a Cruor. You should have been able to flatten its capacitor long before then. And in fact, if I were to lose this particular rig, rig, I actually only dropped down to about 3.5 minutes. That is still plenty of time for a Cruor to get a kill. If it takes 3.5 minutes to kill something, then your Cruor is not the right ship for the job, simply put. At 3.5 minutes, if you're running out of capacitor, hopefully your enemy's ship should be out of capacitor too, at which point you can start turning off modules. You're not running the micro warp drive anymore, you're not running the armor repair anymore, so that capacitor stability does kind of lie to you. Now the reason I say it's not the most important is because if we look at that power grid, you'll see that with me at Expert Frigate Engineering 5, I'm 131 out of 132. Now you can either achieve this if you don't have Expert Frigate Engineering 5, you can either achieve this by losing the quality of some of these things, going from meta level 8 down to meta level 5 or 6 for example, that reduces the amount of power grid required, or you can swap this particular rig for something like an ancillary power grid router 2. And in fact I was using an ancillary power grid router 1 up until last night when Expert Frigate Engineering 5 hit. I then swapped it out for a semiconductor memory cell just to see how stable I can make things. Now the other side here, the power grid rigs, I've gone for a laser collision accelerator 3 for 17.5% additional flat damage, a 12.5% reduction to the activation time thanks to a laser burst aerator 3, and I've actually fitted 2 of these currently because having 2 burst aerators is better than having 2 collision accelerators. There is a penalty bonus to the second one, of course, as it says here at the bottom, but burst aerators are theoretically slightly better DPS than collision, therefore if you're going to double up on either of them, double up on the burst aerator. That said, again, this one can be swapped out, and you can swap this for something like a Trimark Armor Pump 3 to give you additional armor and help you survive passively a little bit longer. You'll do less damage, but again, the aim is to get your opponent down to cap 0. You've only got to survive until they run out of capacitor. If they run out of capacitor, you can suddenly switch off everything except your weapons and just keep them at that stage and rip them apart slowly. That said, for me it's kind of hard to say no to that 422.61 DPS. Yes, you drop down to I think it's about 395 if I take that burst aerator 3 out, the second burst aerator 3 out and swap it for armor. So I do lose a bit of DPS. DPS isn't overly vital, but since I use this a lot for PvE as well, I like having that little bit extra. Theoretically then, the burst aerator 3, it's kind of up to you. I would personally go for the Trimark Armor Pump, but I just like playing a little bit high risk, high reward, and being able to kill something that little bit faster. To help showcase this capacitor drain in effect, my wife has very kindly offered to demonstrate, and she's been able to record on her side of things as well, so that we can actually showcase both my point of view and her point of view at the same time to showcase how effective and how terrifying the Cruor's capacitor warfare can actually be. So she's come out here in her stabber. It's a standard Tech 5 stabber. I'm going to lock on now, and then we are going to set the orbit there of 4 or 5 kilometers. Try and get that to 5, and as we move in now, I'm going to activate that micro warp drive to close the gap, and I'll activate both the neutralizer and the Nosferatu as soon as I hit a close range. So we're nice and comfortably locked on, and here go the modules now. Let's activate those, and bam, straight away she drops down to about 70% of her capacitor. That's a fairly impactful hit, down to 70 just below. The Nosferatu is doing its work. It's going to get another hit of the drain. The neutralizer takes us down to 43%, now at 12 seconds into the fight. Second activation 12 seconds in. We're about to hit the 24-second mark, where that third application comes in, and the capacitor is already down to 6%. That is no longer enough for her to power her shield booster, let alone her afterburner or other modules that she may have. So at this point, she would ultimately need to try and choose to warp away, and that Nosferatu is still doing its work, draining and flattening that capacitor. Now, I have asked her here to warp away, just to showcase that even at absolute flat capacitor, you are still able to actually activate your warp drive. You'll see here, insufficient power to warp the whole way, but even though she's at 0% capacitor, she is still able to actually activate her warp drive and flee off to safety. So you absolutely do still require something like either a warp scrambler or a warp disruptor to help on that one. People often mistakenly claim that the Cruor is only good for PvP, and I want to showcase how wrong that is. So I'm jumping into a Gurista's Small Anomaly Tech 10 at the moment to showcase that this ship can still do this kind of content quite comfortably. Now you see here, as I've jumped in, I've got 3 Pithy Condor 2 interceptors and a Pith Raven Striker, all Tech 10 ships. We're going to orbit those, which I've set the orbit range here to 5-6 kilometers. We're going to then approach with the afterburner active, and once we get into range, I will activate the Nosferatu, and then eventually the turrets themselves. Obviously, with laser turrets, you don't want to activate these too early, as it does impact your capacitor to fire them, even if they're only going to miss. So you do actually need to carefully manage laser turrets. Think about whether or not they need to be active and whether they're firing. There we are. There's the first Condor 2 interceptor down. We'll move now on to the second one. You see how much damage the Cruor can kick out against targets like this, and it has no problem at all tracking onto small, fast-moving targets like Condor 2 interceptors. No problems at all. Very quickly, 1 hit, 2 hit. Is a 3rd hit enough to take it out? Not quite. It does take 4 hits to take out the Condor interceptors. There we go. And we're now on to the Raven. Now, obviously, I am taking some damage to my shields, but we're armor tanking the Cruor here. There is no need whatsoever for me to worry at this point in time. We're not even really coming down towards the time when I would even need to switch on the armor repairers. We're just casually drifting here around this Raven, dealing 970, 1521. Let's actually move this orbit in a little bit tighter and see if we're still able to hit comfortably there, if that affects our damage at all. But we're doing big damage hits. Just takes a while to cut through something like a Raven Striker, because obviously this is a Tech 10 battleship. It's got shield for days, it's got armor for days, it's got structure for days. It's going to take a while to get through this one, even using that heatsink to cut through it. But we will get there eventually. Obviously, there's going to be a long time delay between this, so before we get too bored of this, I am going to skip ahead and show the wave change. At this point, we've just about cleared the 7-minute mark in this anomaly, which I don't think is a bad clear time for the first wave, especially since it's a Tech 10 anomaly, and I'm doing this in a frigate. But there we are, 760,000 ISK for 1 Raven Striker, not a bad bounty at all. What have we got? We've got 2 Pithy Condor 2 Interceptors, we've got a Ferox 2 Guardian, a Moa Interdictor, and another Raven Striker. So again, we're going to start with those Condor 2 Interceptors, interceptors being fast-moving ships. Of course, these are the ones that are going to mess with our speed tank the most. They don't worry about speed tank. It's hard to speed tank other frigates, much easier to speed tank against things like cruisers, battle cruisers, and battleships. So we get rid of those interceptors quickly first, and you see they pose very little threat to us. Then the other ships just aren't really doing much damage either. It's worth spending a moment just to point out that obviously I'm going over footage here that is pre that gate camp that I talked about earlier. This is me up in Tribute, and I am using the fit that I was using when I lost that Cruor. This is the previous Cruor. You can see that instead of the damage control unit, I've got a heatsink going, and we're using an afterburner instead of a micro warp drive. Now for PvE, this build works quite nicely, but it's not particularly great for PvP, and I don't say that just because of the gate camp. I say it because it's hard to close the gap with someone. That said though, if you were using the build that I showcased earlier, basically if you swap out the afterburner for the micro warp drive, and if you swap out the heatsink there for a damage control unit, this is still completely viable. As you can see, even, yes, okay, I'm using an afterburner to help me speed tank, that is reducing the amount of damage I take, but even then I'm not actually having to activate my armor repairer at all. Having a damage control unit, basically that means that I have the capability to avoid the damage at the beginning of the waves. I activate that damage control unit, I take very little damage at the start of the wave whilst I kill those first interceptors. The second half of the wave, I'm just orbiting comfortably at 5 kilometers. I don't have the micro warp drive on, you're just happily sitting there using your ship's standard propulsion systems, orbiting at 5 kilometers, and you'll take very little damage. And if you do happen to get down to armor, you've got an armor repairer that you can just switch on and build that back up. If you do really want to go for PvE, yeah, swap to an afterburner. An afterburner is better than a micro warp drive for PvE, but if there is any possibility at all that you're going to be involved in PvP, then I would stick with the micro warp drive. Anyway folks, I think this has showcased quite nicely how the Cruor works, the idea of it is a capacitor warfare vessel that is designed to flatten your opponent's capacitor and basically rip their ship of all its power and leave them stranded whilst you whittle them down from there. And I also wanted to showcase that yes, the Cruor is completely viable in PvE too. Yeah, sure, things like the Succubus and Daredevil might be able to do it a little bit faster or a little bit safer, but for the most part, I'm just checking on who the red is here in system, whether or not I should be worried, but for the most part, the Cruor can still do Tech 10 anomalies quite comfortably. As you can see, it's a good way of making some ISK in between your PvP roams. It allows you to build another Cruor in case you lose the first one to a gate camp in Tribute, but there we go. Hopefully that's given you some inspiration. I really do love the Cruor as a faction frigate. It's an incredibly unique playstyle. It's terrifying to go up against because someone will sit there and go, oh, look at the amount of damage I'm doing. Look at the amount of damage I'm doing, and they can't move because I've got them webbed. They can't go anywhere because I've got them scrambled. And oh no, suddenly my capacitor's dry and all of my systems have switched off. I've got no tank anymore, and help. Someone help me, please. That is what the Cruor does. Oh, and more reds in system there. Of course, I'm going over pre-recorded footage, so I know I'm completely safe, but obviously it's a little bit nerve-wracking when you're sitting in a Tech 10 anomaly and 2 reds show up in system. Just like, oh boy, are they hunting? Are they a hunting party coming looking for me? So at this point, I start to really sit there and think, right, how am I going to get away? Anyway folks, again, thank you ever so much for watching right the way to the end of this video. I do hope this has given you some inspiration to try out what is probably, in my opinion, one of the best faction frigates out there. If anything, it's second only to the Daredevil. Beyond that as well, it is by far, to me, the most fun of the faction frigates and how unique it is as a playstyle. And I hope you guys enjoy it. Let me know how you find this one. If you enjoyed this video, let me know if you're flying a Cruor and how you fit it, if you've done anything different to I do, so on and so forth. Otherwise, folks, thank you for watching right the way to the end of the video. As always, happy sailing and see you in New Eden.